Lately the world feels a bit like we're all on a boat in some really choppy waters, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Things just seem, well, fundamentally wobbly.
And for the longest time, it really felt like there was one big ship, one major global player confidently setting the course for everyone else.
But the perspective woven through the material you shared with us suggests that dominance, well, it isn't quite as absolute anymore.
Right.
It raises a really compelling question, actually. Is it time for the rest of the world to maybe stop just following that lead?
And maybe consider grabbing a hand on the wheel themselves, or even charting their own courses.
Exactly, or charting completely distinct courses altogether.
That's precisely what we're diving into today. Our mission here is to really unpack why this viewpoint seems to be gaining so much traction right now.
Okay.
We're going to look closely at the economic currents causing some of this turbulence, the shifting political winds, and even some of the internal challenges within that historically leading player that the sources suggest are, well, prompting this whole global rethink.
And we've got a fascinating range of insights to explore in this deep dive, based on what you provided, from, specific trade talks and military incidents,
Right, and the D.
all the way up to the bigger picture stuff like changing alliances and domestic issues that inevitably spill onto the global stage. It paints a complex, very dynamic picture.
Okay, so let's start by looking at what the material describes as the shifting ground beneath that giant, the United States. For decades, the prevailing view was pretty clear, wasn't it? The U.S. was the undisputed economic and military heavyweight.
Absolutely. Sort of dictating the tempo, you could say.
Yeah.
And the analysis you've given us goes straight to the heart of that, suggesting that while that power was, and still is, immense, significant cracks are definitely starting to show in that foundation.
It's not about predicting collapse, is it? More like,
No, no, not at all. It's more about an erosion, maybe, of that once unquestioned authority. A bit of fraying around the edges.
it really makes you pause and consider some specific points raised in the material. Like, take alliances, for instance.
Okay.
The material highlights moments that kind of make observers scratch their heads. There's this note from June 12th, 2025, mentioned in the Deccan Chronicle,
Right, I saw that.
characterizing Pakistan as a great partner in fighting terrorism. Now, the perspective presented is that statements like that, depending on how you view that relationship historically, can feel, well, completely out of sync with the reality on the ground. It makes long-held partnerships seem questionable,
Mm.
or maybe based on something other than deep shared purpose.
Yeah, it points perhaps to a pattern where maintaining alliances might be driven more by, let's say, immediate strategic convenience or just political messaging,
Right.
rather than deeply aligned long-term principles. And when those partnerships start to look transactional, it naturally leads other nations to question their reliability, doesn't it? And maybe start looking elsewhere.
Okay, then the focus shifts quite a bit to the economic picture. The U.S. economy, often described in the material using analogies suggesting immense but maybe troubled power, seems to be facing some serious headwinds. The idea of trade wars not just continuing but potentially reigniting with a new kind of unpredictable intensity.
Yeah, the selective tariff idea.
Exactly. Specifically with these proposals for selective tariffs based on a country's past trade surplus with the U.S., the sources strongly link this, well, chaotic approach to the potential return of former President Trump within his first 100 days. It paints a picture of real economic uncertainty.
It sounds less like a strategic, carefully planned economic policy and more like,
Well, one idea floating around suggests it's almost like a game of economic Russian roulette.
wow, okay.
This kind of unpredictable, tariff-heavy approach is seen as highly disruptive. Disruptive to global markets, disruptive to the supply chains that have been built up over decades. And the consequences of that disruption, they aren't just theoretical, are they? This kind of chaotic approach to trade, especially with tariffs.
It hits home.
It means higher prices on goods, for you, for me, for everyone, everywhere. Think about the cost increase you might see on something like a smartphone.
Yeah, definitely.
Or even, to use an example that resonates with the material, the price of samosas. Whether you're buying them on a street corner in New York or, in Delhi, it directly impacts people's everyday lives, their budgets.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And shifting gears to the military dimension, the material acknowledges the vast global footprint of the U.S. military, sure, but it also portrays it as being stretched incredibly thin.
Juggling commitments everywhere.
Right. Across numerous fronts, Europe, the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific,
Yeah.
that inherently creates vulnerabilities.
And there's a particularly stark example highlighted, isn't there? The drone strike in Jordan back on January 29th, 2024.
Yes, that was tragic.
That attack killed 3 American soldiers, injured 34 others. The analysis uses this specific incident to really underscore that the U.S. isn't invulnerable, and that its deep, widespread military engagement carries this significant, ever-present risk of getting pulled into wider global conflicts, sometimes with devastating local consequences.
So when you put these points together, this sort of perceived unreliability or transactional nature of some alliances, the economic instability driven by unpredictable trade policy, and this vast, stretched military facing real threats.
Yeah.
It all leads back to that central question posed by the material you shared. Given these significant challenges, both internal and external, is it still strategically sound for the rest of the world to just automatically default to following the U.S. lead?
And the answer the sources seem to lean towards is maybe not anymore.
Increasingly, it seems the answer is leaning towards no, or at least not without serious consideration.
That analysis flows directly into the global economy itself, which the sources portray as this highly interconnected, maybe even fragile system.
Like a Jenga tower, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly like a delicate Jenga tower,
No.
where actions by one major player can have these significant destabilizing ripple effects through the whole structure.
Perfectly put. And that concept of trade wars we just touched on, that's the perfect illustration of pulling a key block out of that tower.
Right.
A major player taking unilateral disruptive action on tariffs doesn't just affect them and the target country. It sends tremors right through global trade networks, investment decisions, everything.
And we see this potentially playing out in concrete upcoming events highlighted in the material. There's specific mention of crucial trade talks between India and the U.S., slated for mid-2025.
Yes, those are flagged as very significant.
These negotiations are framed as having a potentially massive impact on India's economy and, by extension, its standing on the global stage.
And there's a very real, tangible risk discussed for India's key export sectors.
Yeah.
Textiles, pharmaceuticals, technology.
Big ones for India.
Absolutely. The analysis suggests that under a more protectionist U.S. stance, these vital industries could face steep tariffs. And if that happens, well, think about the direct consequences for workers, for businesses in places like Bengaluru or Surat or Hyderabad.
It's not abstract policy at that point. It's livelihoods.
Exactly. It's people's livelihoods potentially impacted.
But the sources also make it really clear that this isn't just about the U.S. anymore, is it?
Not at all.
They introduce the other massive economic force in the room, China, described as wielding these immense foreign currency reserves.
Right.
China is seen as playing a fundamentally different, maybe higher stakes economic game with its active global investment strategy. Things like the Belt and Road Initiative come to mind, though maybe not explicitly detailed here.
That's like one player on the global economic board is using chips denominated in trillions, while others are, well, working with much smaller stacks. And this growing economic influence from Beijing is definitely prompting reactions globally. Well, the material mentions India's strategic moves, like the Modi government's push to limit foreign shareholding in certain sectors.
Okay.
It's explained as a necessary measure, really, to maintain control and protect domestic interests in this shifting landscape.
So the powerful takeaway from this part of the analysis seems to be that the global economy is absolutely not a one-player show anymore. It's definitely a multiplayer arena.
Clearly.
And the material suggests countries like India are recognizing they need to proactively define and execute their own economic strategies, not just react to the big players or wait for the U.S. to stabilize its approach.
Right. Waiting isn't really an option when the stakes are this high. Now, shifting from that economic chessboard to the complex world of international alliances and conflicts, the material portrays this landscape as increasingly fragmented, challenging.
The old certainties feel less certain, is that it?
Pretty much. They point to challenges within long-standing traditional alliances. Take NATO, for example.
Okay, NATO.
It's portrayed less as this perfectly unified bloc and more like maybe a complex family dinner, with internal disagreements bubbling up.
Okay. Like what?
Well, moments like Germany questioning Russia's potential re-inclusion, or members persistently arguing about meeting those defense spending commitments. These are highlighted as examples of that internal friction.
So not always on the same page.
Not always.
Yeah.
And the analysis also directs our attention to specific geopolitical flashpoints causing significant global concern. The ongoing conflict in Gaza, for instance.
Which escalated dramatically around January 29, 2024?
Exactly. It's highlighted for its serious potential to spill over, to escalate into a much broader regional war. And the actions of Iran-backed militias are noted as a key destabilizing factor there.
And while the Hamas-Israel ceasefire talks in January 2025 are mentioned as, a focus point for de-escalation efforts.
The overall picture presented is one of persistent complexity. High risk.
And the U.S. role here. The material implies it's a tricky balancing act, right? Sometimes seen as prioritizing strategic interests alongside humanitarian concerns, maybe leading to perceptions of mixed messages.
That's the implication, yes. A very delicate balancing act. Then you have the tensions simmering in the Indo-Pacific region, also clearly on the radar, particularly the high stakes involved around Taiwan.
That's an area where potential conflict could have truly global ramifications. Everyone's watching everyone else's moves very closely there.
Intensely. But what's particularly striking is how countries are adapting to this more complex, maybe more unstable environment.
How so?
The material highlights India's approach as increasingly proactive, especially in defense strategy. They specifically mention the new military space doctrine unveiled in April 2025.
Okay, a space doctrine. What does that signify?
Well, it isn't just about keeping pace, according to this analysis. It's presented as a deliberate move to build capabilities, to prepare for the nature of potential future conflicts.
So thinking ahead.
Precisely. Recognizing the critical role advanced technology, like satellites, will play. It's about building strength in crucial future-oriented domains.
Interesting.
And finally, the analysis touches on something often overlooked but really crucial. How domestic issues within a major global power can fundamentally erode its credibility on the international stage.
Right, the internal stuff affecting the external image.
Exactly. Examples from the U.S. are used. The persistent struggle with issues like gun control legislation, pointing out how a House bill passed in 2022 after those tragic Buffalo and Uvalde shootings ultimately failed in the Senate, or even past more extreme events, like suggestions floated about potentially postponing elections, as came up back in 2020.
And the perspective offered is what? That this makes it harder to lead.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Perspective is that these kinds of internal struggles, this visible domestic sort of messiness, makes it genuinely harder for a country to be seen as a consistently reliable, focused, or credible international leader.
It invites others to question the stability and internal coherence needed for effective global leadership.
Precisely. It opens the door to those questions.
Okay, so pulling all these threads together now, the analysis seems to provide several really compelling, interconnected reasons why this perspective that the world needs to move beyond just relying solely on the U.S. is gaining such significant traction.
Yeah, let's summarize those. One core reason is simply that the U.S. is portrayed as, well, distracted.
Distracted by?
Deep internal political divisions, the potential for those disruptive trade policies we talked about, and a military commitment stretched thin across multiple global hotspots. The view presented is that Washington is struggling to maintain consistent, focused, global leadership.
And other countries, like India, with their own growing influence and interests, they feel they can't just wait around.
Exactly. They feel they can't afford to simply wait for the U.S. to fully resolve its own pressures. And fundamentally, the world itself has changed. It's just not a unipolar moment anymore.
That comes through loud and clear.
The material strongly emphasizes this undeniable shift to a multipolar landscape. Power, influence, decision-making, it's all much more distributed now.
And we see that reflected where?
Well, in the increasing roles of players like the European Union, the sheer economic weight of China, of course, and the rise of these dynamic emerging powers, India, Brazil, South Africa.
And blocs like BRICS.
Yes. The growing cohesion and significance of blocs like BRICS is presented as clear evidence of this shift. It's not just individual nations, but groups finding common ground.
There's also a pretty significant point raised about perceived, maybe shaky moral authority.
Yes. The analysis mentions instances of what's seen as selective global engagement, or perhaps even hypocrisy.
How so?
Where a country might call out certain behaviors in some nations while maintaining very close ties with others engaged in similar or arguably worse actions. The material specifically references India's external affairs minister, pointing out such perceived double standards back in 2023.
Right, calling out inconsistency.
Exactly. The view presented is that it becomes difficult to accept leadership, or maybe lectures on international norms and values, when there appears to be inconsistency in how those standards are applied globally.
And that erodes trust. Makes others less inclined to just follow.
That's the argument. This erosion of perceived moral authority plays a significant role.
Okay, now stepping back for a second.
Yeah.
Why does all this complex global analysis actually matter to you, the person listening right now?
That's the key question, isn't it?
Because, according to the material, this fundamental global shift impacts, well, pretty much everything. It directly affects international trade dynamics.
Which can influence the prices of goods and services you encounter every single day.
Right. It impacts global stability, the likelihood of conflicts erupting or being contained.
And the delicate balance of power that ultimately affects peace and security for everyone, no matter where you live.
This isn't just abstract geopolitics happening somewhere else. It has tangible local consequences.
Absolutely. It connects globally and locally.
All right, so if the world is indeed in the process of recharting its course, what does this global reset that's discussed actually look like? The material suggests it's not about completely abandoning existing relationships, right? Not tearing everything down.
No, it's portrayed more as an evolution towards building a more balanced, perhaps more distributed global system. It's less about replacing one dominant center with another.
And more about
Creating multiple centers of influence, multiple centers of capability that can interact in new, perhaps more equitable ways.
And the examples highlighted involve countries proactively taking initiative themselves. India, for instance, is described as placing a major emphasis on self-reliance, or Atmanirbhar Bharat.
Right, the Make in India initiative is mentioned as a starting point. But the material stresses that the perspective requires going beyond just catchy slogans. It demands serious, sustained investment in critical, future-oriented areas.
Like technology, green energy.
Yes, exactly. Technology, green energy, and crucially, defense innovation. Bringing up that military space doctrine, again, really underscores the commitment to building tangible capabilities in strategic areas.
So it's framed as strategically upgrading your own national capabilities, ensuring you're not just reacting, but actively shaping your own destiny.
That seems to be the core idea.
Yeah.
Actively shaping your destiny within this changing global environment.
And alongside that domestic focus, there's the importance of intentionally diversifying international relationships.
The analysis suggests moving beyond just relying on traditional alliances, like the Quad, the U.S., Japan, Australia, India grouping.
And actively strengthening ties elsewhere.
Yes, actively strengthening ties with other major regions and blocs, like the EU, Asian countries in Southeast Asia, and nations across the African continent.
It sounds a bit like diversifying an investment portfolio.
That's a great analogy, actually. You consciously spread your relationships, spread your dependencies across multiple partners.
Rather than being overly reliant on just one or two, especially if those traditional relationships are showing signs of strain or unpredictability.
Precisely. It's strategic diversification.
And the material makes a crucial point by bringing the conversation back down to the human element, doesn't it?
Yes, importantly so.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the goal of any meaningful global reset or strategic shift should be about improving life for the average person.
How? Through what means?
Through pursuing fair trade deals, prioritizing investment in essential public goods like education and healthcare, and actively working towards peace.
They circle back to the Hamas-Israel ceasefire talks in January 2025 again here.
Yes, as an example.
Yeah.
Not presented as a guaranteed success, obviously, but as a small, necessary step towards reducing human suffering amidst immense complexity. It grounds the big picture in human impact.
The analysis even weaves in touches of humor and some memorable analogies to help these pretty dense concepts land, which is helpful.
Yeah, like picturing the U.S. as maybe an overconfident chef whose signature global leadership dish is perhaps a bit undercooked or inconsistent sometimes.
Prompting other countries to start cooking their own recipes or demanding different ingredients.
Exactly. Or that idea of certain economic actions feeling like a game of Russian roulette.
Right, highlighting the unpredictable and potentially self-defeating consequences.
It suggests that when the global economic system is treated erratically, ultimately, nobody truly wins, and prices just go up for everyone. These analogies make the complex consequences feel very real, very relatable.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the material you shared with us, the core takeaway feels quite clear, doesn't it? The world seems to be fundamentally shifting away from navigating solely by one fixed point of reference.
Yeah, it's actively charting multiple, independent, and yet interconnected courses simultaneously.
It's a profound transformation. And the analysis uses powerful imagery, like that idea of the global palette changing.
Implying that what the world accepts, what it seeks from global leadership and cooperation. It's evolving.
It really underscores the immense challenge and the ongoing process of building this new, more distributed international system.
Definitely a work in progress.
And that leaves us with a thought drawn right from the heart of this material for you listening to consider as you think about these global forces.
Okay.
In this increasingly complex, genuinely multipolar world where different countries are actively building their own capabilities, assertively pursuing their own interests, forging new kinds of alliances, what does all that mean for the potential for global cooperation?
And for stability, especially when facing shared challenges like climate change or pandemics. And what about the path forward that really requires nations to work together, even amidst all this shifting?
How do you see these major shifts playing out in the world around you, maybe even in your own life?
And what new questions does this analysis raise for you about the future we're all navigating together? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.